I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film-loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to a film critic to help people figure out their lives by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Jason Anderson, to the Real Mental podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
And thank you for coming on today to talk about this really interesting kind of hybrid type film, Emilia, Pérez. I'm very, very interested to hear your thoughts about this film, especially since it kind of encapsulated so many different genres.
It definitely is. It's a mixed bag. There's all kinds of things going on in the movie. And I think that when I first saw it, when it was at the Cannes Film Festival, and it had a big sensation there. It was one of these movies that, as soon as it screens, people are talking about it and feeling very excited about it. And sure enough, by the time I got to see it there, it was, very jubilant audience. And the thing is, whatever the movie is, it is not dull. It kind of moves like a roller coaster or a freight train instead of barely staying on the rails. And there's certainly, I think, a lot of different reactions to the film. But certainly it's something that it's not a mild experience. It's very much in your face.
So why don't you tell me what you thought about it?
I enjoyed it most, actually, of the different things that it is. I think I most enjoyed it as a musical. And that's something where, the people have a lot of different talk about it. But I think that, just in terms of the sort of sheer bravura and energy of those big musical sequences and the sort of choreography, that is a really exciting. And I love musicals. It's certainly things I've seen in recent years that are, nominally musicals, but they don't really sort of take much pleasure in kind of the form. I think that you look at this movie, and there was another movie at the film festival called The End, which is also a musical, but it's just so sad and repetitious. And there's not really great tunes. This one, I think, for whatever Emilia Pérez is, besides that, I think it's got sort of a show personship and an eagerness to kind of dazzle, which I very much appreciated in those big sequences.
Yeah, it was a very interesting musical, but I felt kind of sad that the musical part kind of trailed off sort of 2/3 of the way through. And I thought there was a missed opportunity for a couple of numbers, like right at the very end. I'm not going to give away the ending, but right at the very end, there's a scene where I thought there could have been a song, just to kind of sum up something and some feelings. And then there was another scene a little bit before that when there was some conflict between Emilia and someone personal in her life, which I think, again, could have been a really good opportunity for another song or a duet even. I thought that would have been really great. I don't understand exactly why it started out with so much music and then it kind of ended with so little. So that was a funny choice. And I'm not sure what happened there. What did you think about that?
That's a good point, because I think that like we're saying, that the movie is a mixed bag and there's sort of many genres at once. And I think that, it's kind of like the saying is that the center cannot hold. Like, it kind of is this sort of thing that's sort of full of contradictory ideas and intentions that, it can't cohere in a super satisfying way, because it is sort of trying to do too much all the time. And some of it does well and some of it does less well. But I think that certainly by the last third of the film, it has sort of become much more, I think maybe its other biggest part of its sort of aesthetic DNA, besides being a musical, is that it's a melodrama. And not just like a melodrama, like in this sort of maybe, kind of familiar Bella, like it's a very heightened melodrama that, the audiences may associate with in Spain and Mexico and other Spanish speaking territories. Like that kind of, there was a quality of like very, very, very charged, very emotive, and, kind of ridiculous in a way that's quite knowing a lot of the time too. It's sort of pushing things to kind of almost an absurd extreme. I think that, certainly this, and that's not unusual among sort of soap operas, but I think that like the telenovela style is to push it several notches over the top. And that's kind of what's happening in the film too. It kind of gets more and more kind of florid and berserk. And it's interesting thinking about this in relation to someone like, Pedro Almodovar was the sort of art house master. But he's kind of softened on in his mature films of the last few decades. I don't think you really get this kind of flavor. There's suggestions of it, but this is like a full tilt telenovela melodrama.
Yeah.
And I think that by the time you get to the sort of last stages, like it's kind of pulling out all the stops. And yeah, I mean, certainly musical and melodrama fits together really well. I also would have liked something even just, give me more music, if you're going to go full opera. But instead it kind of becomes almost more of an action thriller, sort of a thriller elements to it in that sort of in the big finale, which I think it's maybe points to, less satisfying for me, and maybe actually fits more with, I mean, it's interesting. This is a director, Jacques Audiard, who was a very revered French director. But my favorite movies of his were his early ones, which were crime thrillers for the most part, or just these kind of intense, little dramas. And he's been doing all kinds of different films. And this is certainly, the wildest thing he's made. But I think that one of his go-to styles, at least in the early part of his career, was to kind of go towards a crime thriller. And that's sort of what this movie towards as well.
Yeah, and I don't mind that, but I feel like he sort of starts out in one direction and goes in another direction, and that's okay, but when he goes in the other direction, things get lost, and that's the part that made me sad because, for example, Zoe Saldana's character, the lawyer, Rita, she was featured very heavily at the beginning, and then as the movie progressed, there was less and less of her as a character and less richness and less of her own internal experience, and her inner experience was so prominent at the beginning, and her frustrations with her career and her feeling like she didn't have an opportunity to advance because of prejudice. And it was like so nice when she had this kind of very odd opportunity to advance and then did become successful. But then you don't really get to see her inner life anymore, and you don't really get to see whether she's happy or whether she's frustrated or whether she's scared with the choices that she's made and with the consequences of those choices. So like she was a character and then she sort of became kind of background, and
Mhm.
that was sad for me because I wanted her to carry through the film, right?
Yeah, I think that she is sort of set up as a particular kind of figure, but she's really ultimately serves a function, and her function is to sort of aid the transition, the sort of the transformation for Emilia, kind of to take her from the sort of pre-transition self and identity to the more realized person of the majority of the film. So Zoe kind of has to be the fixer to make that happen, but then has less of a function beyond that point. And it's sort of something I think that it's interesting because I think the movie, I think kind of suggests it's going to get into the inner lives of characters, and then it doesn't. And I think that's kind of one reason. I mean, looking at, certainly there's been a lot of commentary from trans critics, commentators in the films, because this is like, it's a big blustery movie with, a trans lead character, made by non-trans people for the most part. I mean, they're an incredible trans actress in the lead, but it's people who were the kind of creative team largely outside of the trans community. And so inevitably there's going to be a lot of sort of consternation or concern about how the portrayals are. And I've read really amazing things about kind of why, a lot of trans critics have found this character problematic and lacking, and this representation just something that they can't abide. But the trouble is, I think the movie does it to sort of just about everybody. Like, it's really not really a psychologically realistic person in the film, or particularly well developed. I mean, it's not saying it's not sort of entertaining and exciting to watch them sort of go through what they go through, but it's certainly to sort of look at them and hope that they're going to be, kind of fully realized, emotional and psychological levels, is that's not really happening. They are kind of almost sort of these florid, archetypical, larger than life, but, not very deep ultimately.
And now let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast is at 145 episodes and counting. Why not have a listen to it today? Yeah, it's sad because, there was an opportunity in the film to really give Zoe Saldana's character, Rita, the lawyer, a real character arc in terms of, here she is, this sort of downtrodden lawyer. Then she becomes extremely wealthy and successful. And then she gets reeled back into Emilia's life and she ends up again as a fixer. But then at the very end, here she is with a big, huge responsibility. And you never kind of get a sense of like how she feels about that. And and what she plans to do with that. And that would have been like, that was such a missed opportunity, I feel. That would have been so interesting to kind of have her reflect on, her whole journey in a song, let's say, and how, like, look what things have brought me to now. Here I am in this situation, and this is how I feel about it. And this is what I'm happy about. This is what I regret. That would have been such a great moment to reflect on. And song is such a great way for people to have that kind of soliloquy, right? And I'm so sad that they deprived her of that soliloquy. I'm also sad that the wife, Jessie, had so little character development because she was such an interesting character. First of all, why did she marry, Manita, this drug dealer? Was he a drug dealer when they got married, or was he just a hood who, ended up becoming the successful person? That would have been a wonderful song for her. Like, this was the man that I married, and this is what he turned into. And then, who knew, what was going to happen next, kind of thing. It would have been great because, very often when somebody marries somebody, they aren't at the height of their career. They might be at the beginning of their career or in a different career. And as their marriage evolves, people evolve. And I thought it would have been a great opportunity for Jessie to sing about, who she ended up with from the beginning. And then as she discovers the truth, that would have been also wonderful for her to go, wow. And then this changed, So all these character arcs that were missing. And then, of course, poor Emilia. I think Emilia, it feels like she had the most of a character arc, but not from kind of her singing or her internal, but just from the choices that she made, as you see in the film. But she was the only one, I think, who got to have a little bit more of an inner life that was shown in the story. Does that make
It,
sense to you? Yeah.
yeah, and I think that, I mean, certainly, she's presented as the sort of most, kind of the figure of greatest fascination, certainly, as a trans character whose sort of pre-transition self is this, kind of, again, just grotesquely macho and violent, and this, I think, kind of a cliche of sort of the cartel, the ruthless, hyper-violent figure, but actually feels gender dysmorphia, is as a woman, and is able to transition and then erases the previous self, really. And that's something I think trans critics have really sort of criticized, because it's this sort of extreme negation, like in this sort of fact that the movie has to rely on this very kind of soap operatic plot about the sort of secret, the secret former self. And I think the movie kind of, again, is one of these areas where it sort of falls apart because it just doesn't really know what to do with this stuff. And there's even, I think, a sort of moral gap here, just in terms of someone who was a killer and responsible for a lot of death and mayhem, and has this sort of redemptive, role in sort of in the transitioned life as, a much more saintly woman who is helping people find, the bodies of their murdered loved ones. But I'm like, I don't know. I mean, the movie kind of wants me to believe that Emilia gets a free pass or something. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know if this character's coming back from given the kind of scale of destruction and misery this figure has caused in the pre-transition life. I don't know if I'm really going to get on board with the redemption part of it. So it definitely kind of doesn't, I mean, I think it's sort of in anything, even in the terms of the film, like I think for the film to kind of use, the real life horror and despair of these families and people whose loved ones have disappeared and been killed by cartels and the violence there for many years. I think it's like, I get squeamish about that as kind of a dramatic device as well. But yeah, like I think that's kind of one of these things that it can't quite handle. And I think the figure of Emilia is one that kind of can't be reconciled. It's kind of maybe something that is, is a sort of a kind of a figure that can sort of exist in a movie. And if you keep the sort of velocity of the story, and you can kind of have it sort of seem to make some sense and have some power in the moment. But then when you look back on it, you think, oh, geez, what was I watching? What was I swept into here? What was I supposed to take away about this person's, this tragic arc? I mean, who am I supposed to feel sympathetic for?
Yeah. Well, what I found particularly interesting is that there are really two transitions, right? There's the gender transition, which was very smooth and kind of, no problem, which
Right.
is interesting because often in life, the gender transition is the challenging one because there's a
Yeah.
lot of, pushback from the people in your world. But because she kept it a secret, she could just sort of emerge as a woman in society. And because she had so much money to do such a
Yeah.
beautiful transition, it reminds me of the Caitlyn Jenner transition. You have enough money and
Right.
no one has to know. And no one
Make your
did
own
know.
terms, and make
Yes,
your exactly, which is really from a position of massive privilege, which is
exactly.
hardly anyone has.
Yes, exactly. So here Emilia comes out again as a woman, and no one knows. She portrays a relative of her former self and sets up house with her former wife, who thinks nothing of it, doesn't recognize her former husband. But interestingly, the second transition is the less successful transition, which is the transition from criminal, from thug. And no matter how much she's working to redeem herself, in the end, it's that inner thug that does her in, right? That
Yep.
really gets her into trouble because she cannot let go of that violence within her. She cannot let go of the desire for control and the punitiveness when she doesn't get her way,
Yep.
right? And so what I found very interesting and what I thought that I don't know, I thought was kind of cool was that, the gender transition was fine, but the personality transition was the part that couldn't be changed. Like she couldn't change her personality, actually. She couldn't go from being a criminal to a law-abiding, upstanding citizen. It wasn't a transition that was possible. That was not something she could change within herself as much as she tried. And, poor her to think that by changing her gender, she could also change her personality, which she couldn't. She still was a criminal deep down inside. And it came out, when push came to shove, that criminality came out and it did her in the end.
Yeah, I think it's something, again, like I think about like some things I've been reading about the film, and really it's really like the characters, ultimately a kind of failure of any kind of self-acceptance or any kind of self-actualization, really, that
Yes.
the gender transitions ends up being a bit of a smokescreen. And also with these two kind of kind of what the character occupies is two kind of almost ridiculous extremes, one being the sort of hyper machismo violent, kind of cliche of the sort of ruthless cartel leader, and then this sort of like saintly, woman beyond reproach, and a sort of absolutely sort of figure of sort of love and empathy and glamour as well. And they kind of can't. There's no way for this figure to kind of find any kind of harmony,
Yeah.
especially because the sort of pre-transition self is so abhorrent, to everybody.
Yeah.
And maybe the movie kind of becomes incoherent because the character is kind of fundamentally incoherent, and again, not very close to actual people. No wonder sort of trans critics sort of see this character and think, like, with some horror, like, this is what audiences think trans people are. And it's like, oh yeah, this is a representation that's just kind of just way too sort of problematic and extreme and bizarre.
In Jungian philosophy, there's the concept of the shadow. The shadow in the psyche is all the dark parts of ourselves that we disown, that we don't want to claim. All the violence and the ruthlessness and the brutality and the vindictiveness and the vengefulness, all those, ugly, the greed, the lust, the rage, but like, the out of control greed,
Yeah.
lust, rage, and we don't own it. And the cure for this is to integrate these aspects into our personality, not to reject them as Emilia's character did, but to integrate them, to find quote unquote the positive aspects. So, if there's ruthlessness, to have better boundaries. If there's, greed, is to be in touch with what you want, to find a way to integrate and create a positive. But what Emilia's character did was she completely rejected her shadow. And the cautionary tale in Jungian philosophy is if you reject the shadow, you just suppress it and then it comes out, it leaks out somehow, right, in destructive ways. And sure enough, by completely rejecting her dark side, all the ugliness that Manitas had been, it leaked out and was her undoing. So I thought that was psychologically apt, but just not satisfying necessarily, as a character.
And I think difficult when you sort of map that onto a gender transition too. Like
Yes.
I think that's when particular, pre-transition self and post-transition selves are sort of divided up in that way. I think becomes like, oh, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't. I mean, again, and especially at a point, I think when politically, when there's a lot of demonization of the trans community. I mean, this was very much a thing that was happening in the election. It was
Yeah.
very, and I think
Yeah.
it's a challenge. This is a community that has a lot of vulnerability for all kinds of winning ways. And so to have this one as well, I think it's a lot. And even, at the same time, like, I think it's a film that it has that, like I was saying, that sort of bravura energy, that sort of in your face, go for broke kind of chutzpah that I think makes it an exciting film to watch, and an emotional one, certainly, in terms of, like, there's some amazing big moments all the way through it, and especially in the first half of the film, where it just is, and the audacity of it is certainly amazing. But it's, maybe something, once you start to kind of hold a light up to it, you think, like, oh boy.
Yes, absolutely. Because when I first watched it, I liked it more, and as I step back from it a little bit more, I kind of gone like, "Ooh, this is a little problematic."
Yeah, but it's it. And I think, it's interesting to see what will happen when it becomes, whether it'll kind of get more awards momentum, heading into the Oscars. I mean, it's certainly a bit of an open field right now. They're not really necessarily a bunch of really obvious, Oscar, favorites. And this one certainly has been popular. It certainly has, done extremely well at festivals like TIFF. I think it won the second place for the audience choice. I mean, audiences just go for it in a big way. So it'll be interesting to see what if it is something that, kind of comes towards and has sort of the full sort of mainstreaming and shrining of greatness that, Oscar campaign or success will do.
Yeah, I hope not, only because I would like a film more like Will and Harper.
Mhm.
If there's gonna be a film that represents trans people, I would want that film to be the one, because that film was vulnerable, was not melodramatic,
Yeah.
and just told a story of a person who needed to transition for their own sake because, it was something important to them, and something they had to do, as opposed to, you know, completely changing their personality. They were still who they were post-transition, but they transitioned to being a woman, as opposed to, you know, everything that Emilia changed in her life completely, other than being rich and privileged, right?
Right. And that's, I think, something that is a much justified criticism, that sort of, like, that kind of, every transition story is its own unique thing, but certainly decided that it's sort of like this kind of, obliteration of the previous self is something that is, like, that's not how people live their lives. And to sort of feel that kind of shame and secrecy about, like, it certainly isn't psychologically healthy. And as you can tell, it doesn't turn out that well for Emilia Perez either. So,
Yeah, for sure. Well, still, it is an interesting film. It definitely gives us food for thought, and it provokes conversation, which I suppose in this day and age is always a good thing.
certainly, and even that, I think there's a lot of, also, like, I mean, sort of like another big question is, like, is Selena Gomez good in this movie? Because I think there was sort of, like, a lot of talk about, is her accent okay? Because she's speaking, Spanish, like, too much like an American speaks Spanish, but I don't know. I enjoyed Selena a lot. I think in the movie where I was kind of gave up on the idea that I was supposed to be having some sort of realistic view of these people. I'm like, I wanted movie stars being movie stars, and I'm like, and Selena Gomez was all the way there for me.
Yeah, I thought the acting was good. I didn't have any problem with the acting. I think, like you said at the beginning, he bit off more than he could chew, and I don't think he was sure what kind of movie it was. And because it was trying to do too many things all at the same time, it kind of imploded a little bit, partway through. But I think the acting was great, and I think the actresses definitely deserve to win the prize. But maybe the movie, can just be looked at as an exercise that
Yeah,
maybe wasn't successful but was interesting.
we shall see. But
Yeah.
yes, I think it's gonna be keep getting seen. Like, I think it's definitely something that's gonna be talked about and seen for a good while yet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you again, Jason Anderson, for coming on the Real Mental podcast. Please remind the listeners where they can check you out if they're interested in getting into your work.
Great. Well, they can see some of my film writing in places like Sight and Sound, cinemascope.com website, and Broadview magazine.
Wonderful. Well, thanks again, Jason.
Great. Thanks again.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts, And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasarotamd.com. While you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 140 episodes and counting? And if you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasarotamd.com. Happy listening!